Welcome back. You are listening to Reformed Thinking. I'm your host, and I'm sitting down here in the studio with our resident theologian to dig into another theological deep dive.
Thanks for having me back. It's always great to be here and just dig into the text.
Yeah, and for those of you listening, you know what we do here. We are Protestant Christians, we hold to the Westminster Confession, and we like to take a look at biblical scholarship through a very specific theological lens.
Right. We try to find the theological signal in all the noise of the academic research.
Spot on. And usually we tackle massive doctrines, things like predestination or the hypostatic union. But today we are taking a completely different approach.
We really are. We're starting on the ground floor today. Very microscopic.
Just one single word, actually.
Yeah, just one word. But it's a word that functions as a skeleton key for the entire narrative arc of the New Testament.
Which sounds like a bold claim, but looking at the source material you pulled for this deep dive, it's not just a vocabulary lesson.
Far from it. If you don't catch the historical background of this one word, you'll miss how the gospel moved from a local Jewish context to a global faith.
You miss the actual mechanics of the covenant of grace.
Precisely. It's the whole thing.
So let's give them the word. The word is Hellēn.
Hellēn. H-E-L-E-N in English transliteration.
Right. And in our English Bibles, it is almost always translated simply as Greek.
Yeah, and it looks completely harmless on the page. You see Greek, and you think, you probably just think of a guy in a toga.
Right. Someone eating olives, quoting Plato.
Or you think of a modern nationality, someone holding a passport from Athens.
But the sources show that definition falls apart pretty fast when you read the New Testament.
It shatters completely. Sometimes Hellēn means a person geographically from Greece, but other times it's a synonym for a Gentile or a pagan.
And sometimes it designates a specific cultural class, which is fascinating.
That ambiguity is where the treasure is. The history of this word shifting from a tribal name to a cultural status, then to a religious threat, and finally to a badge inclusion in Christ.
That is the history of redemption right there.
It really is the history of redemption in a nutshell.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace that lexical history. We want to understand how the barrier between Jew and Greek was built up over centuries.
And then how the gospel completely demolished it.
And since we operate in the Reformed tradition, we have to ask what this means for the covenant today. What does it mean for you, the listener, right now?
Because if we don't know who the Greek was to the Apostle Paul, we don't really know who we are to God.
Let's start at the beginning then. The etymology. I was pretty surprised looking at the notes to see that Hellēn wasn't always this massive umbrella term.
No, it had a very humble origin. We have to go back into the mists of mythology.
Way before the New Testament.
Long before. We are talking about Hesiod and the early Greek origin stories. Originally, Hellēn was just a guy.
A literal person?
A specific individual. According to the mythological source material, he was the son of Deucalion.
And Deucalion is a big deal in their myths, right?
Right. Deucalion is the protagonist of the Greek flood narrative. He is essentially the Greek equivalent of Noah.
Okay, that makes sense.
He survives the Great Deluge, and his son is named Hellēn. So initially, the term Hellenes just referred to his direct descendants.
So it's just a tiny tribe?
Very tiny. They lived in Thessaly. It was a hyper-local clan designation.
Like saying the Campbells in Scotland or something.
That is a great comparison. But language is fluid, and over centuries, these small tribes in the Balkan Peninsula started to coalesce.
They traded, they fought.
Yeah, and the term expanded. By the time you get to classical historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, Hellenes had become the broad designation for all Greek-speaking peoples.
And this creates a massive division in the ancient world.
The Great Binary. In the classical mindset, humanity was not a spectrum of different equals.
It was two buckets.
Two buckets. You were either a Hellēn or you were a barbaros, a barbarian.
I have always loved the background on the word barbarian. It's an onomatopoeia, isn't it?
It is. To the Greeks, their language was refined. It had complex grammar and musical tones.
So foreign languages sounded like nonsense to them.
Just gibberish.
Blah.
Bar. So initially, the dividing line was purely linguistic.
If you spoke Greek, you were civilized.
You were in the club. If you didn't, you were a savage.
But the research points to a significant shift that happens later. The notes highlight a rhetorician named Isocrates.
Isocrates is a huge figure here. He moves the goalposts from blood and language to something far more abstract.
He makes a statement that basically alters Western history, doesn't he?
He does. He says that the name Hellenes suggests no longer a race, but an intelligence.
Wow.
He argues that the title applies to those who share our culture rather than those who share a common bloodline.
That is a massive conceptual jump. He is completely decoupling ethnicity from identity.
Yes. He is saying you can become a Greek even if you were not born one.
Assuming you adopt their culture. The specific word in the text is paideia.
Paideia, which is a tough word to translate into English.
Let's define that for the listeners. What exactly goes into paideia?
It translates roughly to education, but it goes way deeper than reading and writing. It is total cultural formation.
Upbringing, worldview.
All of it. The gymnasium, the theater, the rhetorical training, the philosophy. It was the systematic shaping of the human soul according to their highest ideals.
So if you submitted yourself to that process, you became a Hellēn.
Regardless of who your grandfather was, you were culturally Greek.
The notes mention a really fascinating historical example of this playing out with the Romans.
Oh, this is critical for understanding the New Testament context. The Romans conquered Greece militarily.
Right, they won the wars.
But the poet Horace famously noted that captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror.
Meaning the Romans fell in love with the culture of the people they just defeated.
They adopted the paideia, educated Romans, hired Greek tutors, they learned the language, they studied the philosophy.
So you have these Roman elites who have zero Greek blood, categorizing themselves as Hellenes.
In a cultural sense, yes. And we see this in the Bible. Look at Romans chapter 1, verse 14.
Okay, let's pull that up.
Paul writes, I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians. Now remember, he is writing to the church in Rome.
Right.
The educated Roman reading that letter would absolutely identify with the Greeks in that sentence.
Because they considered themselves the civilized ones.
Yes, they looked at the unwashed tribes of the north, the Gauls, the Scythians, the Germans, and called them barbarians.
So Hellēn essentially becomes a massive status symbol. It means you are civilized, you read Homer, you appreciate art.
It means you are rational, you are part of the enlightened world. And this project of cultural expansion went into hyperdrive with Alexander the Great.
The Alexander effect.
When Alexander swept across the East, his goal wasn't just grabbing territory, he was colonizing minds.
He planted cities everywhere, dozens of Alexandrias.
And in those cities, he built gymnasiums, he built them in Persia, in Egypt, in Syria.
He created a globalized world.
Exactly.
A Syrian or an Egyptian could learn the language, start dressing a certain way, attend the gymnasium, and effectively cross over to become a Hellēn. It is basically the most successful example of cultural imperialism in history.
Without a doubt. But then, this cultural steamroller hits an immovable object.
The Jews.
Right. There was one group of people who absolutely could not just adopt this culture as a harmless addition to their lives.
And this is where the lexical history turns into an actual war.
It gets violent.
The source material takes us to the intertestamental period. For you listening, this is the gap between the Old and New Testaments, specifically the Maccabean era.
And we see a brand new term pop up in the sources here, Hellenismos.
Hellenism.
Yes. In the book of 2 Maccabees, Hellenismos is pitted directly against Iudaismos Judaism.
This is the first time we see Judaism named as a distinct system like that, isn't it?
It is. And it is named that way precisely because it was under severe threat.
So the binary is no longer civilized versus savage. It is now the Greek way versus the Jewish way.
And you have to understand, this wasn't a debate about preferring a different style of architecture or pottery. It was deeply theological.
The notes highlight the high priest, Jason.
Jason is a tragic figure. He was a man who actually bought his office through bribery.
Not a great start for a high priest.
No. And his goal was to modernize Jerusalem. He wanted to make it a cosmopolitan Greek city.
So what does he do to achieve that?
He builds a gymnasium right under the citadel in Jerusalem.
I think we need to pause here. For a modern listener, we hear the word gymnasium, and we picture a local recreation center. Maybe a place with some treadmills and a basketball court.
Right, it sounds completely harmless to us.
Why was building a gym viewed as a declaration of war against the God of Israel?
Context is everything. The Greek gymnasium was inextricably linked to pagan religion.
They were dedicated to false gods.
Always. Dedicated to Hermes or Heracles. But even more than the statues, it was about the philosophy of the body.
Okay, unpack that.
Participants exercised in the nude. The Greek ideal glorified the natural human form.
And for a Jewish man, the sign of the covenant circumcision is literally marked in the flesh.
Exactly. Public nudity in a mixed cosmopolitan environment wasn't just socially embarrassing. It was a distinctive marker of separation.
If you were unclothed in a Greek gym, Everyone in the room immediately knows you are a Jew.
You are marked as the other. You represent an archaic, barbaric religion to them.
And the sources mention something truly horrific that came out of this social pressure. Some Jewish men tried to hide their circumcision.
The medical term is epispasm. It was a surgical procedure to reverse the appearance of circumcision so they could blend in.
That is just painful to even think about.
It shows the sheer intensity of the cultural pressure. They were literally carving the covenant of Abraham out of their flesh just to fit into high society.
It is the ultimate form of assimilation.
Complete surrender. And notice the other sign of assimilation, the notes mention the patassos.
The specific Greek hat.
The broad-brimmed Greek hat. Again, it sounds trivial to a modern ear. Oh, the kids in Jerusalem are wearing trendy Greek hats.
But in 170 BC, wearing that hat was a loaded political and religious statement.
It was signaling to the world, I am a cosmopolitan. I am part of the global culture. I am not held back by the restrictive laws of Moses.
It's ancient identity politics.
Precisely. And this is exactly why the Maccabees finally revolted.
They realized what was at stake.
They saw that becoming a Hellēn was not just about learning a new language or adopting fashion. It was apostasy.
It was a worldview that inevitably demanded idolatry.
From a Reformed perspective, thinking about the concept of the antithesis, the stark dividing line between the church and the world, this was the sharpest that line had ever been drawn in history.
To be a Hellēn was to be an open enemy of God.
You could not be both.
So by the time we open the pages of the New Testament, this word Hellēn is carrying an unbelievable amount of weight.
It is loaded with centuries of cultural baggage, warfare, and identity crisis.
It is practically radioactive. Let's look at how the Gospels handle it. It is really interesting the notes point out that the word rarely appears in the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke barely use it.
But there's one specific incident in Mark chapter 7 that jumps right off the page. The Syrophoenician woman.
Mark 7, verse 26.
Right. It is a pivotal moment. The text explicitly describes her as a Hellenist, a female Greek.
But then it immediately qualifies that by saying she is by race Syrophoenician.
There is that distinction again. Ethnicity versus status.
Ethnically, she is from Tyre or Sidon. She is Phoenician.
But Mark labels her a Hellēn. In this context, it almost certainly refers to her religion. She is a pagan Gentile.
And likely her social class too, right?
Yes, she is probably an educated, upper-class woman who speaks the language of the elite.
And this wealthy pagan woman comes to Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, asking for a miracle for her daughter.
And Jesus gives her what is arguably one of his most difficult responses in all the Gospels.
He tells her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw to the dogs."
That is a hard text. We really can't sanitize that language.
We shouldn't even try. He is reinforcing the salvation historical barrier that existed at that time.
The children at the table are the physical descendants of Abraham, the Jews.
The dogs are the Gentiles, the Hellenes.
He is effectively telling her, the covenant is not for you. My mission right now is to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
But her reaction is amazing. She doesn't get offended or walk away. She argues back.
She accepts the premise of his theology, but she argues for his grace.
She says, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs."
She fully accepts her position as a Hellēn, an outsider. But she appeals to the sheer overflow of the Messiah's mercy.
And Jesus grants her request. He commends her faith.
It is a crack in the dam, a preview of what is coming.
But the real shift, the moment the definition of the word starts to undergo a massive pivot, seems to happen in John's Gospel.
John uses the term with thick theological irony.
Look at John chapter 7, verse 35. The Pharisees are actively mocking Jesus.
Right. They say to each other, "Where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks?"
They meant it as a total joke.
Yeah.
Like, he is such a failure as a rabbi here in Jerusalem. His only option left is to go preach to the unclean pagans.
It was meant as a biting insult. But the irony, which John definitely wants the reader to catch, is that this is exactly what the Messiah is going to do.
He absolutely is going to teach the Greeks.
Through his apostles, yes. He will gather them in.
And then we get to John 12. This is such a critical chapter.
The final week of Jesus' life. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem has just happened.
The tension in the city is snapping. And Philip gets a tap on the shoulder.
Someone says to him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus."
And who is doing the asking?
The text says, certain Greeks.
Now, the research suggests these were likely God-fearing Gentiles.
Right. These were not full pagan idolaters offering sacrifices to Zeus. They were people who admired the monotheism and ethics of Judaism.
They probably attended the synagogue, sat in the back rows, listened to the Torah.
But they hadn't formally converted. They hadn't taken the step of circumcision.
So they are Hellenes, standing right on the threshold of the covenant. And what is Jesus' reaction when Philip tells him?
You might expect him to say, bring them over, or tell them I'm busy dealing with Israel's leaders right now.
But his reaction is cosmic.
He hears that Greeks are looking for him, and he declares, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified.
That always gives me chills when I read it. Why does the arrival of a few Greeks trigger the hour?
Because in John's specific theology, the hour is always a reference to the crucifixion.
The cross.
Jesus understands that the gathering of the nations, the full inclusion of the Hellenes, can only happen through his substitutionary death.
He immediately follows up that statement with the analogy of the grain of wheat.
Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit.
And the fruit he is talking about is the nations.
The Gentiles. As long as Jesus is living, walking around Galilee in the flesh, he is the Jewish Messiah fulfilling the promises to Israel.
But in his death and resurrection, the middle wall of partition is broken down.
The arrival of those Greeks was the divine signal. The exclusive mission to Israel is concluding. The mission to the entire world is about to explode.
And that explosion happens in the book of Acts.
It does.
But here we run into a bit of a lexical puzzle in the text. The notes distinguish between the word Hellēn and another very similar word, Hellenistus.
The Hellenists. This causes a lot of confusion for readers. We see it early on in Acts chapter 6.
A complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution.
So the obvious question is, who are these Hellenists? Are they Greeks? Are they Gentile converts?
The consensus among scholars, and our source material backs this up heavily, is that these people are Jews.
They are ethnically and religiously Jewish, but they are Greek-speaking Jews.
They are members of the diaspora who have moved back to Jerusalem to live.
So picture the social dynamics of the early church in Jerusalem. You have the Hebreo, the local native Jews.
They speak Aramaic. They're very traditional in their customs.
And then you have the Hellenistai. They are Jews, but they speak Greek as their primary language.
They might dress a bit more like the broader culture. They read the Old Testament from the Septuagint translation instead of the Hebrew scrolls.
And natural friction occurs. It is a cultural clash inside the very first church.
The Aramaic speakers were perhaps looking down on the Greek speakers as compromised or lesser Jews.
Or perhaps it was just a genuine language barrier that led to administrative oversight. We don't know for sure.
But the practical result was that the Hellenist widows were going hungry.
So the apostles have to step in and solve this administrative crisis. They decide to appoint the first deacons to handle the distribution.
And looking at the list of the 7 men they chose, Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor.
Timon, Parmenas, Nicholas. Those are not Hebrew names.
They're all Greek names, every single one of them.
It is a massive pastoral gesture. The apostles, who are basically all Hebrews, appointed 7 Hellenists to fix a problem affecting the Hellenist minority.
They empower the marginalized group to lead the solution.
It was an act of radical, spirit-led unity.
But the word Hellenist appears again later in connection with Paul.
It does in Acts chapter 9, verse 29. Paul is in Jerusalem, and the text says he was disputing against the Hellenists.
And they try to kill him.
Right. Which proves that the term Hellenist didn't automatically mean Christian.
These were non-believing, Greek-speaking Jews who were zealous for the law and saw Paul as a heretic.
This brings up a fascinating side note about Paul himself. Was the Apostle Paul a Hellenist?
That is the great paradox of his life. In Philippians 3, he calls himself a Hebrew of Hebrews.
He was trained at the feet of Gamaliel, the most respected Pharisee of his day.
Yet he was born in Tarsus, which was a major university city heavily steeped in paideia.
He spoke and wrote fluent, highly educated Greek.
He casually quotes their pagan poets in his sermons, Herodotus, Epimenides, Menander.
Paul was a man who straddled the geopolitical fault line of his era.
He was a Hebrew who could operate seamlessly in the Hellenistic world.
Which is exactly what makes him the perfect instrument for God's redemptive mission. He had the credentials to debate in the Jewish Sanhedrin and the intellect to debate the philosophers in the Greek Areopagus.
But the real turning point in Acts, the moment the dam actually breaks, and the definition of who can be saved changes forever, is in Acts chapter 11.
The Antioch incident.
This is huge.
Yeah.
The text says that believers who were scattered by the persecution following Stephen's death traveled as far as Antioch.
And initially, they spoke the word to no one except Jews.
Some of them, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, arrived in Antioch and began speaking to whom?
The notes point out a major textual variant in the manuscripts here. It is a debate over literally one letter in the Greek.
Some manuscripts say they spoke to the Hellenists, the Greek-speaking Jews.
But logically, that wouldn't be breaking news. They had already been evangelizing Greek-speaking Jews since Pentecost.
Other manuscripts, and the source material suggests this is almost certainly the correct reading based on the context, say they spoke to the Hellenists,
The Greeks.
the uncircumcised Gentile pagans.
This is the massive breakout. Up until Acts 11, the gospel had gone to Jews.
It had gone to Samaritans, who were essentially ethnic cousins.
And it had gone to Cornelius, who was a God-fearer already attached to the synagogue.
But here in Antioch, for the very first time, regular pagan, idol-worshipping Hellenes are being evangelized directly, with no Jewish prerequisites.
And what happened? The text says, "The hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord."
God blessed it immediately.
This is the birth of the Gentile church. And it is no coincidence that Antioch is where the disciples were first called Christians.
Why did that label originate there, at that specific moment?
Because the old sociological labels were completely broken.
You couldn't just call this gathering a Jewish sect anymore.
There were way too many uncircumcised Greeks in the room.
But you couldn't call them a Greek philosophical society either.
Because there were plenty of Jews, and none of them worshiped the Greek pantheon anymore.
So the outside observers in Antioch looked at this mixed multitude, eating together and worshiping together, and had to invent a brand new word.
Christianoi, the people of the Christ.
That is a striking reality. The term Christian is the label that emerges specifically when the dividing wall between Jew and Greek collapses.
It is the manifestation of what early writers called the third race appearing in history.
This perfectly transitions us into the theology of the Apostle Paul.
Because Paul, the Hebrew of Hebrews, is commissioned as the apostle to the Hellenes.
And in the opening chapter of Romans, he sets up a massive courtroom scene, and he specifically indicts them.
Romans 1 is the grand theological indictment of the Gentile world.
Paul uses the term Greeks here to represent the entirety of non-Jewish humanity.
And he targets the very thing the Greeks prided themselves on the most, their Sophia, their wisdom.
The Greeks were the philosophers of the ancient world. They viewed themselves as the logical, rational ones.
They were the undisputed masters of the intellect. But Paul looks at all their philosophy and says that despite claiming to be wise, they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened.
Now, the notes point out a crucial nuance here. Paul is not saying they lacked intelligence.
He is not saying they were mentally deficient. He is saying they actively suppressed the truth.
This ties directly into the doctrine of general revelation.
Paul argues that the invisible attributes of God, his eternal power and divine nature, are clearly seen in the things that have been made.
The Greeks did not lack evidence for the true God.
They had the paideia, they had advanced logic, they charted the stars, they understood mathematics.
But they took all that truth and suppressed it in unrighteousness.
This is the classic Reformed understanding of total depravity. The issue isn't that the Greek mind couldn't process the data of creation.
The issue is that their will was fundamentally opposed to the Creator.
Their highest cultural achievements, without special revelation from Scripture, led them straight down into the darkest idolatry.
They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things.
So you have this high-minded Greek philosopher claiming to be the pinnacle of human wisdom, bowing down to worship a statue of a snake.
Paul exposes the absolute madness of it.
And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he contrasts this earthly wisdom of the world with what he calls the word of the cross.
For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles.
Folly. The Greek word used there is moria. It is the root of our English word moronic.
To the Greek mind, the message of the cross was aesthetically repulsive and logically absurd.
A god does not die.
And a god certainly does not die the shameful death of a state criminal on a Roman cross.
That concept is not beautiful to them. It does not fit into any of their rational categories.
So the Greek worldview has a fundamental structural inability to accept a crucified God. It is a locked door to them.
Unless the Holy Spirit regenerates the mind.
Which is why Paul continues in that passage. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God.
The gospel completely subverts the Greek demand for wisdom by offering a divine wisdom that looks like sheer foolishness to the natural man.
So Paul develops this robust theology where the Greek is naturally lost, suppressing the truth, and unable to embrace the cross through intellect alone.
But then alongside that, he has this operational formula he repeats over and over in his letters and his ministry.
To the Jew first and also to the Greek.
Eudaios te proton kai Hellēn. It is his standard operating procedure everywhere he goes.
He enters a new city, goes straight to the Jewish synagogue first, usually gets kicked out, and then turns to the Gentile marketplace.
Does the word first in that formula imply better? Is there a permanent hierarchy in the kingdom of God?
The text says no. Romans 10:12 makes it explicit. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him.
The notes make it very clear. The distinction is not a difference in value before God.
It is a difference in the order of redemptive history.
The Jews had the historical head start. They were the elder brother in the narrative.
To them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law.
So the gospel goes to them first as a covenantal courtesy, a fulfillment of the ancient promises made to the patriarchs.
But the great leveler comes in Romans 3:9. We have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin.
They are completely equal in their guilt.
Like equal in guilt, which means they are completely equal in their desperate need for grace.
The ground is perfectly level at the foot of the cross.
But practically speaking, working this out in the first century church was incredibly messy.
It caused massive internal conflict.
You had Jewish Christians, the Judaizers, who insisted that the Greeks had to become culturally Jewish before they could be recognized as true Christians.
They demanded that Gentile male converts be circumcised and keep the dietary laws.
And this leads us to one of the most brilliant case studies in the New Testament regarding Paul's pastoral strategy.
The tale of two disciples, Timothy and Titus.
I really love this comparison in the notes. It shows Paul operating with incredible nuance.
He is playing theological chess here. Let's look at Timothy first in Acts chapter 16.
His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was a Hellēn.
So in the eyes of the strict, traditional Jews, Timothy is a half-breed.
And Paul wants to take young Timothy along with him on his missionary journeys, which involves going into Jewish synagogues.
So what does Paul, the great champion of Gentile freedom, do?
He circumcises Timothy.
Which seems totally contradictory at first glance.
I thought Paul was the guy who wrote that neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. Why put Timothy under the knife?
Because with Timothy, it was a matter of missiological strategy, not a requirement for salvation.
Everyone in that region knew Timothy's mother was Jewish. By their cultural law, he was considered Jewish.
If he remained uncircumcised, he would be a massive, unnecessary stumbling block to every single Jew they tried to evangelize.
They wouldn't even listen to a word he preached.
So Paul has him circumcised to remove the cultural offense, purely for the sake of the mission. He surrenders a freedom to win a hearing.
Okay, now contrast that exact situation with Titus.
Titus appears in the letter to the Galatians, chapter 2.
Titus is a full-blown Hellēn. Both of his parents are Greek. He has absolutely no Jewish blood or background.
And Paul intentionally takes Titus with him to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles right into the stronghold of the Judaizers.
And predictable, the Judaizers demand that Titus be circumcised. They want to fix him.
And Paul's response, he says absolutely not. He utterly refused to compel Titus to be circumcised.
Not even for the sake of keeping the peace.
He didn't yield to them for a moment.
Why the drastic difference? Why cut Timothy but vehemently protect Titus?
Because with Titus, the truth of the gospel itself was on the line.
If Paul had given in and circumcised Titus, he would have been conceding the theological argument.
He would have been officially admitting that a Gentile must become a Jew in order to be justified before God.
He would have been physically rebuilding the middle wall of partition that Christ died to tear down.
So for Timothy, the circumcision was about being a considerate guest in Jewish spaces. For Titus, avoiding circumcision was about defending the core definition of salvation by grace alone.
By keeping Titus uncircumcised, Paul was issuing a declaration. The Hellēn is fully accepted in the beloved exactly as a Hellēn.
He doesn't need to adopt the Jewish culture. He is washed clean through faith in Christ alone.
That perfectly brings us to the grand conclusion of Paul's sociology, the doctrine of the new humanity.
Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
And he repeats it in Colossians 3:11. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all.
Now, we need to be very careful with our definitions here so we don't misunderstand Paul.
Right. Does this text mean that human ethnicity simply ceases to exist when you become a Christian?
Did Titus stop being an ethnic Greek?
Did he stop liking his cultural foods or speaking his native language?
No, of course not. The text doesn't say there are no longer any Greeks. It says, in Christ, there is neither.
The source notes specifically point out that Timothy's father is still referred to historically as a Greek, even after these theological shifts.
Ethnicity remains a reality. Cultural background remains. What is permanently erased is the religious barrier and the covenantal exclusion.
So becoming a Christian doesn't mean we turn into a featureless, homogeneous blob of humanity.
No. It means our ethnic heritage no longer determines our spiritual standing before a holy God.
That is the key. The source links this directly to 1 Corinthians 12:8.
For in one spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one spirit.
Baptism is the key mechanism here.
Baptism officially replaces circumcision as the outward sign and seal of the covenant.
Circumcision was inherently ethnic and national. It marks off one specific bloodline.
Baptism is universal. Water is applied to men and women, Jews and Greeks. It marks the boundary of the new humanity.
This theology fits perfectly with how the Westminster Confession defines the Catholic or universal church.
Yes, the confession makes it clear that the covenant of grace under the New Testament is no longer confined to one physical nation as it was under the law.
It is now administered to all nations.
The elect of God are actively gathered from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation.
The specific designation Hellēn, which for centuries meant the outsider, the barbarian, the idolater, the violent enemy, is washed completely clean. Before we wrap up today, there is one final, somewhat speculative section in the research that we need to touch on.
It connects our word Hellēn back to the Old Testament in a really surprising way.
Yeah, this is a great detail for the folks who love biblical prophecy. The notes mention a direct connection to the book of Daniel.
If you read the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the word Hellēn is used to translate the Hebrew word Javan.
Javan. That name goes all the way back to the Genesis table of nations. He was one of the grandsons of Noah.
Right. Javan is recognized as the ancient ancestor of the Greek peoples.
And in Daniel's apocalyptic prophecies, Javan, representing the Empire of Greece, plays the role of the great, terrifying enemy of God's people.
We are talking about the vision of the goat in Daniel chapter 8, the king of the north.
The archetype of the anti-God political power.
Culminating historically in figures like Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who literally sacrificed a pig on the altar and desecrated the temple.
So in the Old Testament prophetic imagination, the Greek is the ultimate bad guy, the desolator.
The great oppressor. But look at the breathtaking reversal the gospel accomplishes.
Paul takes the very term that represented the historic archenemy of God's chosen people, the Hellēn.
And he looks at them and says, you are now fellow heirs of the promise.
That is the ultimate plot twist in redemptive history.
The ancient enemy becomes the beloved brother. The one who is historically far off has been brought near by the blood of Christ.
It is a total, staggering transvaluation of their identity.
And the irony continues even deeper. Think about the wisdom the Greeks spent centuries seeking.
Their beloved Sophia.
They actually find it, but they don't find it in the academy or the philosophy schools.
They find it in the person of Jesus Christ.
As Paul writes to the Colossians, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge.
The Greek desire for wisdom wasn't inherently wrong. They were just looking for it in the completely wrong place.
They were looking at the created order, at mathematics, at their own fallen logic.
They needed to look at the eternal logos made flesh.
That is a beautiful place to land the plane. Let's briefly summarize the historical progression of this word we've tracked today.
We started with a small, localized tribe in Thessaly, descended from a mythological figure,
which then expanded into a massive, imposing culture defined by paideia and rigorous education,
which violently collided with Judaism and became a dark symbol of idolatry and apostasy,
which Paul then utilized as the theological category for all of lost, unregenerate humanity in Romans 1.
And finally, through the foolishness of the cross, the Hellēn becomes a full, equal participant in the covenant of grace.
It truly is the entire story of the gospel contained in a single word.
Now, we always like to leave you, the listener, with something to chew on, a provocative thought to take with you as you work through the text on your own.
We talked about Romans chapter 2 a bit earlier, The source material mentioned that the Greeks, even without the Bible, had a law written on their hearts.
Right. Paul says their conscience bears witness, either accusing or excusing their actions.
They didn't have the Torah, the written law of Moses, but they had the undeniable testimony of conscience and creation.
So here is the thought to consider. If the pagan Greeks of Paul's day, who lived in a dominant culture of rampant idolatry, sexual immorality, and spiritual confusion,
if they were held strictly accountable by God for the little light of creation and conscience they possessed,
how much more accountable are we?
we who have the full, completed scriptures in our native language.
We who have the New Testament, 2,000 years of church history, the creeds, the confessions, the Reformed traditions.
We have podcast apps loaded with sound theology. The Greeks suppressed the truth of general revelation. The question for us is, do we suppress the truth of special revelation?
That is a highly sobering question to end on. Jesus said, "To whom much is given, of him much will be required."
Indeed. The historical barrier is down, the Hellēn has been brought in, but the severe call to personal holiness remains.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the word Hellēn. We sincerely hope it changes the way you read your New Testament this week.
Keep thinking critically and keep reading the text.
Thanks for joining us on Reformed Thinking.